Okay,
Yeah.
so today we're diving into something that's been making a lot of headlines lately, the Uniform Civil Code in India. It's a pretty complex issue with a lot of strong opinions on both sides. We've got a whole bunch of articles and research lined up.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating topic. We're not just talking about tweaking a few laws here and there. This is a proposal for a fundamental shift in how personal laws are handled in India.
So just to be clear for anyone who might not be familiar with this, what exactly does the Uniform Civil Code aim to do?
Well, it basically proposes replacing all those religion-based personal laws, the ones that are different for Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Parsis, and so on. The UCC wants to replace all those with one common set of secular laws, and those laws would apply to every single citizen regardless of their faith.
So no more separate rules for marriage, divorce, inheritance, all that stuff. Everyone would be under the same legal umbrella.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is, this isn't some brand new idea that just popped up. It's actually right there in the Indian Constitution. Yeah. Article 44 specifically directs the state to work towards establishing a uniform civil code. Of course, actually getting everyone on board with such a big change, well, that's a whole other story.
I can imagine there are a lot of different viewpoints on this. So let's start with the arguments in favor of the UCC. Why are some people so passionate about pushing for this?
Well, one of the biggest arguments is that it could lead to greater gender equality.
Okay, how so?
A lot of it comes down to the fact that different religious personal laws, well, they often have different rules for women. And in some cases, those rules can create some pretty significant disparities.
I'm thinking about things like triple talaq in Islam. That's where a husband can divorce his wife instantaneously without her consent. And then there's the issue of unequal inheritance rights for women under certain personal laws. Is the UCC aiming to address those kinds of issues?
Absolutely. The whole idea is to create a level playing field where everyone has equal rights and protections under the law, regardless of their gender or their religious beliefs.
That makes a lot of sense, but I imagine it can't be that simple. Changing traditions and practices that have been around for centuries, especially when those practices are closely tied to people's faith and identity, that's got to be incredibly difficult, right?
Yeah, that's where the concerns about religious freedom come in.
Right, because for many people, their personal laws are deeply intertwined with their faith.
Exactly. Critics worry that a uniform code could end up infringing on the right to practice religion and potentially even erasing some unique cultural practices.
So it sounds like there's this really tricky balancing act, trying to promote equality while also respecting those deeply held beliefs and traditions. How do the people who support the UCC address that?
Well, their argument is that the UCC isn't about imposing any one religion or culture's values. It's about upholding these universal principles of justice and equality. They believe that India needs to modernize its legal framework and align it with those global standards of secularism and human rights. And they see the UCC as an essential step in that direction.
So they're framing it as a way to actually enhance individual freedoms, not to restrict them. But I'm sure not everyone sees it that way. What are some of the other anxieties that people have raised about the UCC?
Well, another big concern is the impact it could have on India's cultural diversity.
How so?
Critics argue that a one-size-fits-all code could end up homogenizing the unique practices of different communities. They're worried that it could erase the rich tapestry of traditions that makes India so unique.
Instead of embracing that diversity, it could flatten it out,
Exactly. And then there's the practical side of things.
right? Trying to implement something like this in a country as vast and diverse as India.
It's a monumental undertaking. Just drafting a code that would be acceptable to all those different communities, that's a massive challenge in itself.
So we've got this tension between the potential benefits of equality and modernization, and then the concerns about religious freedom and cultural diversity. But this isn't just some theoretical debate, is it? I understand there's actually a place in India where the UCC is already in effect.
Yeah, you're talking about Goa.
Right. Goa is the only state in India with a uniform civil code.
It's a legacy of their Portuguese colonial past, and it covers things like property rights and marriage. But even the Goa model has its critics.
Oh, really?
Yeah, some people argue that it still contains elements that disadvantage women.
Interesting. So even with a working model of the UCC, there are still issues to work out.
It just highlights how complex this whole thing is. Finding that perfect balance is really tough.
And I imagine the political climate in India doesn't make things any easier.
Definitely, the UCC has become a very politicized issue. Some people see it as a way to marginalize minorities, while others see it as a way to impose the will of the majority. And that kind of rhetoric often overshadows any attempts at having a nuanced discussion.
It's like the UCC is being used as a political football.
Exactly. And then there's the role of the judiciary.
Right. The courts have weighed in on this as well, haven't they?
Absolutely, India's courts, including the Supreme Court. They've actually urged the government on several occasions to consider implementing a UCC, especially when it comes to issues of gender justice.
Yeah, I remember reading about the Shabano case. The court basically argued that a UCC was essential for ensuring fairness for Muslim women.
Precisely. So you see, we have all these different pieces of the puzzle. We have the Constitution, the potential benefits, the very real concerns, the Goa model, the political wrangling, the legal challenges, the judiciary weighing in. It's quite a lot to unpack.
It definitely is. So where do we go from here? I mean, we've laid out the historical context, the potential benefits, the concerns, the situation in Goa, the major challenges. It seems clear that there are no easy answers here.
You're absolutely right. This isn't a simple issue. The UCC debate really forces us to grapple with some fundamental questions about individual rights versus national unity tradition versus modernity,
Hmm.
and what it truly means to be Indian in a secular democracy.
We're talking about deeply held beliefs, cultural identities, the very essence of what makes India unique. These aren't things that can be resolved overnight.
You've got that right. It requires a lot of careful thought and consideration.
So how do we even begin to navigate this incredibly complex terrain? It feels like finding a solution that satisfies everyone is almost impossible.
It's definitely a daunting task, but I think there are some potential paths forward that are worth exploring. Maybe we can find ways to address those legitimate concerns without throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Okay, so maybe there's a middle ground, a more nuanced approach. Let's dive into those possibilities in the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
Yeah, it does feel like we've stumbled into a bit of a quagmire here, but I'm curious. We talked about gender equality as a big argument in favor of the UCC. Are there other potential benefits that proponents point to?
Oh, absolutely. There are actually several. One of the big ones is the idea that a common set of laws could really streamline the legal system.
Okay, so less bureaucracy, less confusion, simpler for everyone.
Exactly. And that could be a big win for everyone involved.
Makes sense. What else?
Well, another argument is that the UCC could contribute to a greater sense of national integration.
So the idea is that having everyone under the same legal framework could foster a stronger sense of unity.
Precisely. It's like the idea that a common language can help unite people.
Right, instead of focusing on religious or cultural differences when it comes to the law, everyone would be on the same page, legally speaking.
Exactly. And that kind of shared legal identity could help to reduce communal tensions and foster a more harmonious society overall.
So they're envisioning a more unified, more cohesive India. But I'm guessing critics would argue that true unity comes from respecting differences, not from trying to erase them.
That's exactly right. And that's a central point of contention in this whole debate.
So they're worried that instead of leveling the playing field, the UCC could actually tilt the balance of power.
Exactly. They fear that it could be used as a tool to impose the values of the majority on minority communities.
Leading to the erosion of those religious and cultural freedoms we were talking about.
Exactly. They argue that a uniform code would fail to adequately account for all those diverse beliefs and practices that make India so unique.
It's like they're saying, hold on. India's strength lies in its diversity, not in trying to make everyone conform to a single mold.
Precisely. And they often point to specific examples of practices that they fear could be outlawed or restricted under a uniform code.
Okay, like what?
Well, for example, some Muslim groups have expressed concern that a UCC could interfere with Sharia-based practices, like polygamy.
And I imagine some tribal communities would also be wary of a UCC, especially those with their own long-standing customs and traditions.
Absolutely. They worry about the impact it could have on their traditional ways of life, their cultural identities, their autonomy.
So essentially, we have these two competing visions of India. One that sees unity through uniformity, a shared legal identity for everyone, and another that sees unity in diversity, where different communities are able to maintain their distinct customs and traditions.
That's a great way to put it. And that tension really lies at the heart of this whole UCC debate.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture stuff.
Yep.
But what about the nitty-gritty, the practical concerns? I mean, we touched on the complexity of drafting the code itself. But what about the actual implementation? How would a UCC even work in a country as vast and diverse as India?
Yeah, that's a critical question and one that critics often bring up.
What are some of their concerns?
Well, they point to the potential for legal loopholes for unintended consequences. They argue that even
How would a UCC be enforced? How would it be adjudicated? How can we ensure that it's fair and just for everyone?
exactly, it's not just about the content of the code itself, it's about all those practical realities of making it work in the real world.
And then there's the whole issue of building consensus. I
Yeah.
mean, how do you even begin to get everyone on board with something like this?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It feels like every step forward is going to be met with resistance from one group or another.
It's definitely a challenge, but the people who support the UCC argue that the potential benefits are worth it.
So what's their strategy?
Well, they believe that by focusing on areas of common ground and by making sure that all stakeholders have a voice in the process, it's possible to create a UCC that upholds both individual rights and the common good.
So it's about finding that sweet spot, that delicate balance.
Exactly. But even with the most thoughtful and inclusive approach, there are bound to be some bumps along the road.
Well, it's true of any kind of major social or legal reform, isn't it?
You're absolutely right. Change is rarely easy, especially when it involves things like faith and tradition.
So it sounds like the key is to really listen to people's concerns, to try to build bridges instead of walls.
Precisely to show people that progress and tradition don't have to be mutually exclusive.
So how do we as individuals engage in this conversation in a way that's constructive?
Well, I think it starts with education. Take some time to really learn about the UCC. What are the arguments for and against it? What are the different perspectives within your own community? And then engage with people who hold different views than your own. Listen to them, try to understand where they're coming from.
Have those tough conversations, even if they're uncomfortable.
Exactly, because this isn't just some abstract legal debate. The outcome of these UCC discussions could have a real impact on people's lives.
So this is something that we should all be paying attention to.
Absolutely, it's a conversation that deserves our time and our thoughtful engagement.
Well, I think we've done a good job of unpacking some of the key issues here.
We've looked at the historical context, the potential benefits, the concerns, the situation in Goa, the political dimensions, the legal challenges.
And that tension between unity and diversity.
This is a debate that's going to continue for a while.
So as we head into the final part of our deep dive, I think it's time to shift gears a bit. We've talked about the what and the why of the UCC. Now let's talk about the how.
Okay, sounds good.
Let's explore what a nuanced and practical approach to the UCC might actually look like.
Yeah, maybe there's a way to address those legitimate concerns without throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Exactly. Let's see what we can come up with. So we've talked about the good and the bad, the hopes and the fears surrounding this whole Uniform Civil Code thing. But is there a way to make this work? A way to address those concerns about individual rights, while still moving towards a more just and equal society?
Well, I think the key is to maybe step back from this idea that it has to be all or nothing. You know, maybe instead of trying to replace every single personal law, we could focus on identifying those areas where reform is really needed and where there's a chance of actually building consensus across different communities.
So more of a strategic approach, a targeted approach.
Exactly. Prioritize those areas where change could make the biggest difference.
So instead of one giant monolithic code that covers everything.
Right. Maybe we start by harmonizing those key areas where there are clear disparities, or where the existing laws are just blatantly discriminatory.
Okay, so what kind of areas are we talking about?
Well, for example, ensuring equal inheritance rights for women across all religions.
Yeah, that's something that could have a huge impact, not just on women's economic security, but on their overall social standing,
Absolutely. Or addressing practices like triple talaq.
which has been widely condemned as being incredibly unjust.
Exactly. Those are areas where there's already a growing consensus that reform is needed.
And maybe by tackling those issues first, you can start to build some trust and show people that change is possible.
It's like dipping your toes in the water instead of diving head first.
Right. Give people a chance to see that it's not about erasing their traditions.
It's about finding ways to make the system fairer for everyone.
Okay, so we focus on those key areas. But what about the process itself? How do we actually go about making these changes in a way that's inclusive and respectful?
Well, I think that's where the idea of a truly participatory process comes in.
So not just legal experts and politicians making decisions behind closed doors.
Right, we need to bring everyone to the table.
Representatives from different religious groups, different cultural communities.
Everyone who would be affected by these changes needs to have a voice.
So it's about creating a code that people feel like they own.
Exactly, not something that's imposed on them from above.
That sounds incredibly challenging, but also incredibly important.
It is challenging, but I think it's the only way to create a UCC that truly reflects the values of all Indians.
And it's probably a lot more realistic than trying to force a one-size-fits-all solution on such a diverse country.
Definitely. But even with the best intentions, there are going to be disagreements.
And we were talking about issues that are deeply personal and deeply intertwined with people's identities.
Absolutely. So the key is to approach these discussions with a spirit of empathy and a willingness to compromise.
Right. To acknowledge that there are legitimate concerns on both sides.
Exactly. The people who support the UCC, they see it as a way to promote equality and justice. The people who are wary of it, they're often concerned about protecting their religious freedoms and their cultural identities.
So how do we as individuals navigate this? What can we do to make sure that we're engaging in this conversation in a constructive way?
Well, I think it starts with education. Take the time to really learn about the UCC. What are the arguments on both sides? Talk to people in your community, get their perspectives. Don't be afraid to engage with people who see things differently than you do.
Have those tough conversations even if they're uncomfortable.
Exactly, because this isn't just some abstract legal debate. This is something that could have a real impact on people's lives.
So we need to take it seriously and approach it thoughtfully.
Absolutely. This is about the future of India, and it's a conversation that deserves our attention.
Oh, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We've looked at the history, the arguments, the challenges, the potential paths forward.
It's been a really fascinating discussion, and I hope it's given our listeners a better understanding of this complex issue.
Me too. It's
Yeah.
definitely a topic that warrants further exploration and discussion.
So, as always, we encourage you to keep learning, keep asking questions, keep those conversations going. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Uniform Civil Code in India. We'll see you next time.